Welcome to another week of Beck. We're very excited that you're here today. I'd like to start out by acknowledging our sponsors. So we have the Department of Ecology and Evolutionary Biology, Communication, the Cookson Institute, and the Anthropology Department. We meet every Monday from 12 to 1:30 here in this room. You can find out more about our upcoming speakers as well as see videos of some of our past speakers at beck.ucla.edu. There will be a sign-in sheet that's going around. Has it started going around yet? Might be in the hall. It will go around during the talk. Please, if you did not sign in out in the hall, please sign in as it comes around. It helps show our sponsors that this is a vibrant, exciting community, and helps us request funding and justify our existence generally. So I'm very excited for such a great turnout today. So before I introduce today's speaker, I'm just going to give you a little preview of the next 2 weeks. So next week we have Lynette Shaw from the University of Michigan. Her talk is entitled Cognition, Culture, and Complexity, Modeling the Emergence of Shared Social Realities from Individual Mental Representation. And then the following week we will have Terry Deacon from Berkeley. His title is TBA, but we will probably have it by the announcements next week. Excellent. So it is my great pleasure to introduce our UCLA colleague, Brooke Scelza, for her talk, Husband, Lover, Pater, Genitor, Paternity and Concurrency in Northwest Namibia. Please join me in thanking our speaker.
Hi everyone. I realized it's the last time I gave a Beck talk was like my first month as a faculty member at UCLA. So we've got about 10 years worth of work to catch up on, and I am planning on showing you almost all of it. so bear with me. So I'm going to begin with this odd graph, which actually looks at sleep patterns. And these are the sleep patterns of Himba men. And what I want you to notice here is the top bars are pretty standard, right? So you're going to bed sometime a little bit after sunset, sleeping for a reasonable period of time, 6 to 8 hours typically, and then waking up at or a little bit after sunrise. Pretty normal, right? And then on the bottom two bars here are something that looks really different. So what you see is lots of activity going up till about midnight, a very short period of sleep, and then waking up and another period of intense activity before sunrise. And what's happening here often is that these are men who have gone to visit a girlfriend, and they're not supposed to arrive until sometime in the late hours around midnight, and then they have to get up and get out before sunrise. And so this is a pattern that we actually see pretty frequently in the communities that I work in, because most men and women have, in addition to a formal marital partner, they also have one or more informal partners. So to give you a sense of what this is like, I'm just going to show you a couple of quotes. So first, a woman says, if you have a husband and no boyfriend, you are not a person. Even the husband might leave you because he will see that you are not a good woman. And somebody else said, you can love your husband, but you can still have another boyfriend. Even sometimes you love him, meaning the husband, so much. You embrace him even when you're milking the cow. But when he goes, you take the other. And from an evolutionary perspective, this is fairly strange. So men having multiple partners is often viewed as a good thing, particularly for fitness. So you see this kind of curve where more partners is going to bring you more benefits in terms of fitness. But the standard conventional wisdom was that this was not going to be very useful for women. So having more than one partner at a time typically wasn't seen as leading to any kinds of benefits. And the underlying assumption here as to what it's kind of feeding into this logic is that having one partner who you have a very strong link to was better than having 3 partners that you had weak links to, okay? And part of the reason for that is that men should be disinclined to invest when their paternity confidence is low, right? And that pair bonding and the stability and paternity certainty that comes along with pair bonding should increase women's access to resources and the reliability of those resources. But this assumption doesn't always fit everywhere. So there are times when having more partners might actually be better than having only one. So if male mortality is high, right, and this very reliable partner could somehow disappear at the spur of the moment, that might be a reason why having a backup plan is a good idea. When resources are stochastic, right, so you can't always count on this man having something on a regular basis to help you. When partners offer complementary resources, when partner availability fluctuates, so maybe the resources are stable, but he's only there half the time. And when male resources are less critical and more substitutable. Those all might be cases where you might see this kind of situation being superior to this one. And then there's a second kind of aspect to this, which is why would men tolerate high levels of female concurrency? So it may be that the costs of female concurrency are outweighed by other kinds of costs so that they actually tolerate this in some cases. So if the costs of mate guarding are really high, that might be one reason to do this. If there's a surplus of females so that male desertion doesn't cost you very much in terms of being able to find another partner. If there are low investment expectations, so if you misallocate some investment, it doesn't cost you that much. Or if child labor further reduces investment costs. So you're investing in a child who may not be your biological offspring, but that child is bringing in important labor to the household. So I'm going to talk today about both pieces of this puzzle. First, the female part of the equation, and then the male part. So in terms of the female puzzle, we first want to understand how Himba view formal and informal partnerships, and then look at some of the benefits that women might be getting from having multiple partners, in what ways they might benefit, and then thinking about how those preferences might change in relation to the kind of need that they have. And then I'm going to turn to thinking about men, first of all by looking at how often concurrency actually results in extra-pair paternity, how accurate men and women are at detecting it, and then looking at whether men titrate their investment based on their own paternity confidence. Okay, so this is work that comes out of the Kunene Rural Health and Development Demography Project, which I'm a director of, so I should probably be able to say the name of it correctly. Our field site's in northwest Namibia, so up in the corner of the country there. And I work mainly in a place called the Omohonga Basin, which is semi-arid, but there is a seasonal river, and so that means that we can reliably find the same families over and over again every year. And so my work has centered around about 45 extended family households, and we have about 2,000 people in our database. There's a variety of work that we do in the project, all different kinds of methodologies. So we're collecting anthropometrics, lots of survey and demographic data, and then also some kind of one-off experiments, which I'll show you some of those today. Okay, a little bit about Himba culture and ecology. So Himba are semi-nomadic agro-pastoralists. So in addition to having cows, goats, and sheep, they also, in this area in particular, have gardens where they're growing maize and sorghum and melons and things like that. They continue to be a subsistence-based economy, but increasingly there's access to markets and cash. So you see more store-bought foods coming in, but the vast majority of their subsistence is actually still coming from milk and maize from their own gardens and livestock. Contraceptive use was quite low until very recently. When I first started collecting data on this, there were no current users. That has changed, so now young women are starting to use contraception more reliably. Access to healthcare and formal schooling are also both on the rise. So most adults have had very little schooling, but the kids are more likely to be going to school. A little bit about romantic partnerships. So all marriages are formally arranged with bride price paid. It's a relatively small bride price for pastoralists. And they're arranged by kin, but once you're over the hump of the first marriage, whether it's a man taking a second wife through polygyny or a woman who is divorced and marrying again, those marriages are more likely to be love matches where the couple choose each other and then they'll go to their family just for formal approval and arrangement of the marriage. Polygyny is common. Child marriage is also common, but it's not always consummated, and there's not always co-residence that occurs after a child marriage. I'm not going to talk too much about child marriage today, but I'm happy to answer questions about it. Divorce is common and can be initiated by either sex at relatively low cost. You just kind of leave. and there's not a lot of penalty there. And concurrency is also common, so most people have both a formal and informal partner. And just to get a sense of that, so here's a breakdown by age and sex, right? And so this is asking what % of people in each group have an informal partner. And this is actually limited to married individuals. So these are people who have a spouse, and then they have at least one informal partner as well. And you can see that it's the majority of people across age groups. Okay, so first, to have an understanding of what Himba think about the costs and benefits of concurrency, I just recently did a consensus analysis to get a sort of understanding of what they think the pros and cons are and what the differences are between husbands and boyfriends. So these were looking at female concurrency in particular. And so this was done interviewing 115 adults, and they were presented with 24 true-false questions. The questions were derived from years of focus groups and individual interviews, so I had some sense of what they already thought about these things, and then presented them with these statements. So you don't have to read all these now. I'm going to take you through it. But one thing to understand is just that we're looking for statements that were seen where there was a consensus where people tended to vary from chance. And so they're ordered here in terms of % supporting. And one thing to notice is, right, so here this is a statement where there's very, very strong agreement, right, with the statement. And here there's very, very strong disagreement. In both cases, that's a consensus in the community, right? And there were statements that were designed to be negative to elicit these kind of negative responses, just to have balance and variation in the survey itself. Okay, and then these are statements where there was, you were really basically at chance as to whether people were going to say this was true or false. But 19 out of the 24 statements deviated from chance significantly. Okay, so in terms of pulling out some themes. So one theme that came up is that there seemed to be consensus on statements that were relating to the resource aspect of these informal relationships. So women, so here this one again is one of these negative statements, right? But this was about complementarity of resources. So here we asked them, do husbands and boyfriends give the same kinds of gifts? And they said no, they tend to give different kinds of gifts, right? And boyfriends provide important help during an emergency. Men should bring something for their girlfriends when they see her, even with no sex. Another one about visiting here. And this one, a woman with a wealthy husband doesn't need a boyfriend. So the idea here is if your husband's very wealthy, then maybe you have less need for somebody else. That's sort of a mediocre statement of support, I think. The other thing that came out is that husbands, even though these boyfriends are seen as providing important resources, husbands were really pointed at as being primary, right? So when you think of that graph in the beginning, right, of this strong link between husband and wife and then those weak ties, a more accurate depiction that I think comes from this is that you have one stronger tie and then some additional weaker ties, right? So when this top statement refers directly to that graphic I showed you, right? And here they say, no, a good husband is better than 3 mediocre boyfriends, right? But what we probably should have asked is a good husband and 2 mediocre boyfriends better than a good husband and no boyfriends, right? A more complicated equation. But they say husbands are more reliable than boyfriends. A husband should be able to provide everything a woman needs, right? And then statements like boyfriends are fun, but not very helpful. So just boyfriends alone doesn't seem to be doing the trick.
You can talk about 5,
Yeah, so this points to the cost, right? So we didn't want to paint a really rosy picture of what this is like. So we're also trying to get an understanding of what the potential costs are here. And there were some, and there was strong agreement about that. So is it dangerous for a woman to have both a husband and a boyfriend? Is it okay for a husband to hit his wife if he learns that she has a boyfriend? And this is actually also an interesting one about respect. So in interviews, I've had people say both these things, that women are more respected when they have a boyfriend. And here, actually, it's the negative one, but what they're pointing at is that you're more respected if you have a husband only. So it looks mixed from what I learned previously. So this gives you some sense of, I think, the pros and cons from their perspective. And then what we also have are relationship histories. So we did these kind of mini interviews with men and women about each of their partners. Okay, so we did this with, so far, we're continuing to accrue these over years, so I'm hoping to have a larger sample at some point. But these are 79 women and 42 men, giving us information on over 300 partnerships. 229 of those were informal partnerships, and then 73 of them were formal partners, so marital partners. And each history included information about the length of the relationship, whether they had children together, their frequency of contact, their date of last sex, and the date and what they received last from that person. And then also there were some indicators about relationship strength and quality. Okay, so the first really interesting thing that comes out of this is about the length of these informal partnerships. So here the y-axis is years, right? And what you see here is that these relationships last a really long time. These are not just kind of short-term flings that they're having. For postmenopausal individuals, right, their informal partnerships are lasting decades. It was not uncommon at all for people to say that the relationship started when she was at menarche, and now she's postmenopausal. She may have gone through 2 marriages, but that informal partnership is still in place. And you can see actually the mean length of the informal relationship in this category is greater than the mean for the marriage, right? Because you have a high rate of divorce. Yep.
Do you have instances where a boyfriend becomes a husband, like is a second husband, or is other two?
Yes. And so that's one complication. So this is just the length of the the length of the marriage itself. And yes, some of those definitely the relationship is longer, yeah. And you will actually see them sometimes they've had a couple of kids with the partner as an informal partner, and then eventually they become the husband. But you have other cases where that doesn't happen, right? The man could take her on as a wife, and she says, no, that's not what I wanted. I wasn't interested in having him as my husband. Okay, another sort of indicator of the importance of these relationships, almost half of them have resulted in at least one child. And again, this is a cross-section of the population, right? So some of these may still result in children, but they're interviews with women who are only 19, 20 years old. But you often have kids coming from these relationships. This is about frequency of contact. So these are relationships with people who you are in pretty frequent contact with usually, right? So here this is frequency of contact, and this is how often you talk on the phone. The rarely often is because the one partner or the other is out of cell phone contact. So they'll say, or he doesn't have a mobile phone, right? So yeah, I would talk to him, but I can't. So that gives you some sense, I think, just of the strength and importance of these relationships. And the last thing is, these are not just relationships that are centered on sex, right? So if you look at the last time that they had sex with a husband, that tends to be pretty recently, right? The outliers tend to be things where you have a postpartum taboo, where you haven't had sex for a long time because of a birth. But you see a lot more variation in the time since last sex with informal partners. In general, it's happened in the last year, although I definitely had some cases where somebody said, no, I haven't had sex with him in 2 years or 3 years, things like that. But typically it's sometime in the last year, but certainly not happening as regularly as they're having sex with their formal marital partners. Okay, so now I'm going to walk you through 3 studies that look a little bit more at this female perspective. So the first is a study of preferences. So what do Himba women look for in both husbands and boyfriends, and do those things differ? Then some preference shifts, so looking at food insecurity and whether women's kind of openness to partners increases as the precariousness of their access to resources increases. And then third, just giving you some descriptions of resource transfers. Okay, so do men and women look for different things in a lover than they do in a spouse? The study was done looking at partner preferences for both men and women, but I'm only going to focus on the data on the women just because of time constraints. Okay, so to do this, we had traits that were compiled from focus groups where we asked just general questions. What kinds of things do you look for in a partner? We did a focus group with men and a focus group with women, generated those traits, and then we had each person do 2 sorts, right? So we said sort these traits in order of importance for what you look for in a spouse, so a husband or wife, and then we took the cards back and we had them resort them in what they were looking for in a boyfriend or girlfriend. So these were the traits. They were slightly different. Most of the traits overlapped, but there were some things that only came up in one focus group versus the other. So being polite and being fertile were brought up by men, and generosity and wealth were brought up by women. So those traits differed in the sorts. Okay, so this just gives you a simple ranking. Again, if you want a quick peek at what the men are looking for, they're basically looking for hardworking wives and attractive girlfriends, but that's all I'm going to say about that. In husbands, wealth was number 1, respect was high in both categories, and generosity was highly ranked in what they're looking for a boyfriend. And a better way to picture this is to look here. So what you see here is you're looking for deviations from 0, right? So you don't want the curve to be crossing 0. And so these are traits that women were more likely to want in a husband than a boyfriend. And these were traits that they were more likely to want in a boyfriend than a husband. Okay, so husbands, they wanted them to be wealthy and hardworking. Boyfriends, they wanted them to be generous and attractive. And I just want to focus on this wealth-generosity dichotomy because I think it was really interesting. Okay, so wealth is pretty straightforward, right? Having a wealthy husband. So a woman says, sometimes you have a husband who has nothing. People will say, why do you have that husband? You need a husband who can feed you. But generosity was more interesting because they said you can't actually ask your boyfriend for something. That would be rude, right? In the way that you can your husband. It's just whether he gives you something. So sometimes women would say to us, you know, you have this husband and this boyfriend and he might be wealthy, but if he's stingy, that doesn't help you because what he owes is to his wife. He doesn't owe you anything. It's only whether he chooses to give to you. And so this generosity component, that's why I think it rises above wealth when we're thinking about the boyfriends. Okay. So next, we wanted to look at these preferences and see what we could do to sort of shift them around. And we had measures of food security, so we were curious to see if that had an impact on women's kind of openness to different kinds of partners. And there's some reason to believe this is true. So previous studies have shown that when you prime women with resource scarcity, that they preferred traits in a partner that were related to their ability to acquire resources and parenting traits. And food insecurity in general has tended to predict more sexual partners and more engagement in transactional sex. So to do this, we have a database of photos of people in the community. I think this is based on about 15,000 ratings. And so what people did is they looked through partners of the opposite sex, potential partners of the opposite sex, so people in their community. And if they didn't know them or if they were kin, they skipped them. But otherwise, they were supposed to rate them in general, no specifics here about how much they would want to have that person as a partner, right? So not at all versus very much. And then here we're actually getting sexual histories. So they're rating, have you ever had sex with this person? Press this button. Have you had a child with this person? You press the baby button, okay? And what we were predicting was that women's level of discrimination in terms of how many partners they said they would sort of be open to being with or find desirable would be shaped by their resource concerns. So the more food insecure a woman was, the more partners she would rate as non-zero. And you'll see this is very zero inflated data. So for women, the vast majority of people, they were saying, no, thank you. And then, so we were also interested in resource needs. So the proxy for this here was the number of dependent children. So did women who had more dependent children, would they also be less discriminating in their preferences? Okay, so this is food security alone, and you don't really see any big effects here. You see a sort of non-significant effect of of a trend of more food insecurity leading to fewer 0 ratings, but it's not really very much. But you do start to see something when you have an interaction now between the number of dependents and food security. Okay, so what you've got here is, so these are the 3 categories of food insecurity, and then here number of dependents. And so when you look here at the highly food insecure women, right, the more dependents they have, the less likely they are to rate people as 0, and the more likely they are to rate them in one of these other categories. Okay, the last piece of this is looking at actual resource transfers to try to get a picture of what's going on. So the idea here is if you've got multiple men investing in you, are we actually seeing this on the ground happening, that women are getting things from these other partners? So are they receiving fitness critical resources, and are they getting them? Are these women in need getting them more? So a nice quote about this. So as a woman says, "You can love him if he has things. You need to eat 2 times from the husband and the boyfriend." Okay, so the first pass at this was looking at these really short interviews where we just asked men and women, have you ever given or received any of these items? So this was really a very quick first pass. And we asked them about livestock, meat, cash, clinic fees, hair and beads. So there's hair extensions and kind of trinket items, blankets, and other. Okay. So, oh, sorry, it cut off. Oh, no, it didn't. Sorry. So each category is did women stating whether they received the thing and men stating whether they had given the thing. Yeah. This is asking about their informal partners. Yeah. Sorry. And so you can see that the men are claiming that they've given more than women claim that they've received. That's maybe not that surprising. And you see lots of these sort of small items comes up, and then cash. But also on this ever received, you also do see more important things like clinic fees, meat, things like that. You also see some effects of age and fertility. So women were more likely to have received clinic fees if they were younger. And we also think, so women who are younger are also likely to have maybe only an informal partner and not a formal partner. And in those cases, what we tend to see is that those informal partners take on a more important role because she doesn't have a husband. And women who have more kids were more likely to say that they had received both meat and clinic fees from an informal partner. And then this is looking at the last gift. So what's the last thing that you received from your husband and your boyfriend? And what you see here is cash is overwhelmingly the thing that they are getting most often, most frequently. And you can use that for all sorts of things, but the response when you just ask them, what's the last thing you got, tends to be $100 Namibian or $500 Namibian, things like that. Husbands are more likely to have given food. And these kind of trinket items are coming more from boyfriends than they are from husbands. If we look again at the food security data, what we do see some additive effects. So what you see here is that, so these are women who have boyfriend only, husband only, and who have a husband and at least one boyfriend. And it's the women who are in this category who are the most food secure. So they're the least likely to have to be in the severe food insecurity category, and most likely to have the kind of lowest level of food insecurity. So it does seem like there's probably some additive effect here of being able to get things from multiple partners. And then finally, this is from some older work, but I just wanted to kind of bring this around to reproductive success. So this is looking at the proportion of a woman's births that are claimed as being omoka. So omoka is the term for a baby who's born through one of these affairs, right? And so what you see here is that her overall reproductive success tends to be higher as the proportion of IMOCA births grows until you get into this last category. So if more than 3/4 of your kids are from affairs, then your overall reproductive success is a dip. So this might imply there is some sort of cost here in sort of taking this to the extreme, but in general, having more kids through these affairs tends to have positive effects on reproductive success. Okay, I'm going to move on to the men. Okay, so obviously the burning question here, right, is so these concurrent partnerships are really common. Do they actually result in children being born through these affairs? So I started doing this work because women were reporting this to me in their reproductive history. So they were saying, you know, these kids are from the first husband, these are the second husband, these kids are IMOCA. And I said, what is that, right? I was not actually intending on studying this. And this came up over and over again, and I thought, okay, well, we better start actually adding this up. And then the question becomes, well, so people think this, right? Both men and women tend to think a large proportion of the kids who are socially theirs belong to the husband, or sorry, don't belong to the husband biologically. But is that actually true? And then how good are they? Like they're making a lot of guesses here. How accurate are they? Okay, so first I'm going to show you the results from a genetic study where we looked at this. And then I'm going to talk about social norms about paternity and social partnerships and how that impacts men's investment preferences. And then finally, I'm going to look at some work looking at both social norms and actual investment patterns of men and whether they're titrating based on their paternity confidence. And then I'm going to finish up talking a little bit about how this impacts men's fitness. Okay, but first, so the general idea about humans is that there's very, very low extra-pair paternity. So people tend to think it's at around 1%, maybe as high as 10%, but the general consensus is that it hovers at a pretty low point, right? This is not, and the extrapolation from that is that this isn't really an issue that humans need to worry about very much. But basically almost all of that data comes from European populations, right? Where there are very strong norms about monogamy and very strong costs to women for infidelity. So some of these are data from contemporary populations, some of it is historical data, but all these studies are routinely coming in at about 1–2% rates of extra-pair paternity. And they then cite, and we have cross-cultural evidence of this, because there is one study out there that was done with the Dogon who live in Mali, where they also show an extra-pair paternity rate of just under 2%. The Dogon have extremely strong norms to enforce female fidelity. So they have menstrual huts to be able to track women's cycles. There's a major, major cost to women if they're caught in an adulterous affair. And there's very, very good reason for that in that everything is passed patrilineally. There's patrilocal residence, so that helps to sort of ensure fidelity, and also means that if men are passing all of their resources on, they have a very strong incentive to make sure that they're passing that on to their own biological offspring. So it's not actually very surprising that we see this low number in this kind of context, right? But what we want to know, if we really want to have a full understanding of what extra-pair paternity looks like in humans, we can't just look at historical European populations, who are very odd often in terms of social norms and things like that. And so we want to actually look in places where norms for extramarital sex are more relaxed. And this is a large number of cultures around the world where extramarital sex norms are more relaxed than they are in, say, 1800s, the Netherlands in 1800s. So to be able to look at paternity, we wanted to match demographic data on these paternity assertions with genetic data. So we have 716 DNA samples. From that, we were able to look at 177 pairs of matching husband to child and look at the paternity in those pairs. And we did this using the most advanced methods, which I'm not going to speak in detail about. I'm collaborating with a geneticist at UC Davis, Brenna Henn. But the method that she's using looks at more than 375,000 SNPs. And the idea here is to be able to have a fine-grained resolution where you would be able to even detect instances where like the father's brother is the actual father or something like that. Okay, so this is what a reproductive history would look like. So here is, we asked, were you married at the time this child was born? No. Does the child count as Omoka? Yes. So all out-of-wedlock births are also termed Omoka, but this would not be one of those data points in our study. So we were excluding out-of-wedlock births. Okay, we're only looking at marital births. Here, were you married at the time? Yes. Is the child Omoka? No. So this person thought the child was from the husband. Here, married at the time, but here they thought the child was from the boyfriend, right? So that's how we're pulling out the assertions from the demographic data. This study was a long time coming. It took, we started in 2013, just talking to the community about the idea of this. We were very upfront from the beginning about the fact that DNA could look at not just long-term ancestry, but also ancestry and paternity within families. So we worked hard with the community to come up with a method that everybody felt was fair. We landed on a double-blind method where neither I nor they would ever know any individual level results. So they were presented back with aggregate level results, and we actually looked at the community level aggregate, and it turns out they match very, very well. Which also gave us some confidence that we were not going to be disrupting anything by reporting this back. We also shared the results back in 2018 and didn't move to start publishing these until after we had community consent of the actual results themselves as opposed to just the process. Okay, and this is in collaboration with, so Stony Brook is where Brenna was until very recently, and the University of Namibia School of Medicine and Public Health as well. Okay, so anybody want to wager a guess? Don't tweet these numbers. This paper is under review right now, and I'm hoping to get final word on it any second. Okay, so almost half of the kids. Yeah. And 70% of couples have at least one child who is extra pair. So this is hugely, hugely different from what we were seeing before.
So does this include all three of those people, just the second two?
Just the second two. This is not the yes, 2 and 3. It's not including the kids who are born outside of marriage. It was only looking at kids born into marriages and were they or were they not from the husband. Yeah, so this is conservative in terms of the number of kids who aren't born to husbands, but we were specifically thinking about the extra pair element of it, right? Okay. Okay. Then the next thing that's really cool about this is that people are actually really, really accurate. Okay, so both men and women are more than 70% accurate at being able to detect the kids, whether the kids are theirs or not. And when we reported this back, the response was, oh, we're better than that, right? And what they said was, people are gonna have told you that the child was theirs, but really they know that it's not theirs, right? And actually our data, we were able to look at that and it backs it up really well. So this is the times that they're incorrect, and like 90% of the time that they're incorrect, they are incorrect as a false positive. So saying the child is theirs when it's not actually theirs, right? So exactly what they said to us, that people would be claiming these kids even when they had doubts. And that's partly because this idea of social fatherhood is actually quite strong in this population, and I'll talk about that more in the next studies. But I think that really backed that up. So our bad, that probably more than their bad in terms of the negative results here. Okay, and if just to get a sense of this, so Kermit Anderson has this really nice paper where he looks at paternity confidence across populations, and the sort of low confidence groups in that study come from clinic data, paternity clinic data, right? And so there you've got men who clearly do think the child is not theirs or is unlikely to be theirs, right? Because they've gone to the trouble of going to a paternity clinic. And yet only 30% of those cases are the children actually not theirs. So they're wrong about 70% of the time. right? If you think about it that way. Whereas Himba are correct about 70% of the time, sorry. Okay. So given that, we wanted to have a better understanding of what this all means in terms of how men are weighing these concerns about paternity against other kinds of factors. In particular, factors related to the importance of marriage and these kind of social partnerships. So we did a vignette where we had them distribute resources. The analysis is based on the number of allocations, so it's 258 allocations. And what we did, sorry, yeah, this is right. Okay, so we were basically trying to sort of compare 3 different ideas. So this is basically a mating effort idea, right? In that you should be favoring, sorry, so the green is spouses, the red is girlfriends, and the blue is ex-wives. Okay, so there's 3 different partner types. Okay? And so if you're interested in mating effort, right, you should be favoring your current partners over your former partner, right? And you probably should be favoring the women who've been faithful to you in the past over ones who haven't, but the main distinction here is current partners over former partner. Paternal investment, that doesn't matter as much as fidelity matters. And then social obligation would be putting, oh sorry, this must be wives and this is girlfriends. I'm sorry, the key got cut off. So wives over and ex-wives who you have a socially important and sanctioned relationship with over the girlfriends, these informal partners. Okay, so we presented them with these cards, and each one had a little story. So here we said, this is your wife and this is your biological child. This is your wife and your child, but the real father, the biological father of that child is this guy over here, not you. This is your girlfriend, and this is your biological child. This is your girlfriend, the child is not yours, the child belongs to this guy. This is your ex-wife and your child. This is your ex-wife, and it's your social child, but the father is actually somebody else. Okay, so we were trying to set all these different pieces against each other. Okay, so here's this beautiful but confusing graph that I'm going to talk you through. So one thing you see, right, is that they are favoring fidelity, right? So what you're looking for again here is curves that don't cross over the 0 line. That's the simplest way to understand it, okay? And so here you see they're favoring the wife where the child is theirs over the wife where the child is not theirs. Same thing for girlfriends, and same thing for ex-wives, right? So just very intuitive. When leveling the type of relationship, they're favoring the one where the child is theirs. They're also favoring formal partners, so they're favoring, when you set the type of child equal, right, they're favoring wives over girlfriends, okay? And here, so they're favoring current partners over former partners. So wives over ex-wives. When these two are wives over ex-wives, when you set the type of child equal, and here girlfriends over ex-wives when you set the type of child equal. Does that make sense? Okay. But the bottom line here is when you put all this into the model together, what you see is real evidence for a mixed strategy. So we did model selection, and the best fitting model is the one that includes all 3 factors. So the idea here is that men really are weighing all of these different things when they're making decisions in this imaginary vignette world. Okay. So next I want to move on to this link between paternity confidence, whether they think the child is theirs, and paternal investment, right? So there's a pretty straightforward theory that men should titrate their investment based on the likelihood that they've actually fathered that child. So if you think the child is unlikely to be yours, you should probably be investing less than if you believe strongly that the child is yours. The evidence for this is mixed, both in humans and in other species. You see lots of variations on this theme when you actually are looking at the data. And in humans, the situation becomes even more complex because you have cultural ideas like the idea of social fatherhood, right? And a real importance placed on that role of you're the husband, these children are considered to be yours, whether or not they are biologically, right? And so we wanted to think about how the cost of investment can be weighed against the other kinds of benefits that children can provide to the household, both social, reputational benefits that they count as yours, and also the actual help that those children can provide as members of the household. So this study combines another kind of vignette piece of it that looks at social norms mapped onto actual investment outcomes. So we had 4 vignettes and they looked at issues of transfer of food, payment of bride price for sons, resource transfers, so here transfer of livestock, and fosterage. Okay? And for each of these vignettes, we had an actual investment outcome that we could look at. So we can look at the norm and then look at the behavior. Okay, so I'm going to there's a bunch of these, but they all follow the same pattern. So this is the vignette response. So these are not the actual vignettes, but sort of a summary sentence of each one. But basically, this one was asking, is it okay to hold a special food item, in this case it was meat that they brought back from a funeral, from an Omoka child, and then later give it to your biological child, right? So in all these vignettes, they're biasing against the Omoka child, okay? So then we asked them, is it okay or not okay to do that? And then we said, how common is it that this happens? And is there punishment? Okay? And so what you see here, right, is no, it's not okay. There's a very strong norm that you should be treating your children equally in this case, right? But not that uncommon, right? So about half as to whether they think it actually occurs frequently. But not also, you'll note, not very much punishment. And then we map that onto anthropometrics in this case, right? So do we actually see any differences in the anthropometrics of kids based on whether the child is thought to be Omoka or not? And what you see here, right, so the orange is girls, blue is boys, is that you don't see any real, so you're comparing the blue bars to the blue bars, right? The non-Omoka kids with the Omoka kids. And for boys, you see basically no differences in anthropometrics. In girls, you do see some. So the girls who the fathers believe to be Omoka are lower in weight and BMI. And I will talk about why I think that is, but it's specifically something we see here with daughters. Okay, next outcome. So these were livestock gifts. So is it okay to give 2 goats to your biological child and only 1 to your Omoka child, right? Again, biasing against the Omoka child. Again, oops, sorry. Again, this is not okay, right? Very strong norms. This apparently they thought was more common. And the kinds of punishment that people would talk about are, well, your family would come and tell you that that's not right and they shouldn't do that and you should also give a goat to this other child, or people will think badly of you. Those would be the kinds of things that would go in the reputational harm category. But we don't see any actual differences, right? So again, what we're looking at here is comparing orange to orange, blue to blue. And we looked at livestock. We broke it out, children and adults, just because adults would have had longer time to accrue these gifts. But we don't see, any way we slice it, we didn't see any difference here. So fathers seem to be treating their kids equally. Then we looked at fosterage rates. So are Omoka kids more likely to be fostered out? Like, is it okay, you think this child is Omoka, is it okay then to tell your wife to go bring that child to her family to raise instead of you raising the child? Okay, again, very strong norm that you should not do this. And what we see here, instead of girls being the ones who have the negative outcome, you see a negative outcome for boys. So here, right, the blue is much higher, right? So Omoka boys, Omoka sons, are more likely to be fostered out than Omoka daughters. You'd see no difference for daughters. And finally, bride price, and again, this is going to look only at sons, right, because you only pay bride price for sons. Again, should you pay more bride price for the son who's your biological child? No, absolutely not. You shouldn't do that. People might be doing it, but you definitely shouldn't. So strong social norms again, and really no difference in the amount paid. Okay. So we see overall really strong norms that men should be treating their children equally, whether or not they believe them to be their biological children or not. People really strongly believe you should treat them equally. One interesting thing here is that the more public the investment is, the more likely that we're seeing that people will treat them equally. So if you can, the anthropometrics, right, is probably one of the easiest things, like a little food passed here and there, a little bias in that. It's much easier to impart that kind of bias because it happens under the radar versus something like bride price, which is incredibly public, right? And so we don't tend to see as much titration in the more public domains. So as the social costs of shirking investment rise, men are more likely to treat Omoka and non-Omoka children equally. And they also, I think, are really paying attention to child labor here. So that's why I think we see these two different effects where the girls' anthropometrics are worse, but the boys are more likely to be fostered out. So girls' labor is much more valuable than boys' labor. Boys are herding goats, but girls can do that too, whereas a lot of the girls' labor is not substitutable by sons. And so the girls, may be working harder to kind of make up for the fact that they know they have this detriment of being seen as a mocha, and they talked about that. So if you have this child, you think they're a mocha, but then they work really hard, and so you really grow to love them more, and they may even become your favorite child because she's such a hard worker, right? And they talk about that almost exclusively in the context of daughters who really are working a lot harder than sons are. And again, because boys' labor is less valuable, you may be more likely to foster them out to another household, right? Giving up a daughter is going to have, detriments on your household. Okay, look at that. I'm going to get through all 80 slides. Okay, so the last piece of this is thinking about whether or not this might have costs for male reproductive success, right? And so I want to try to break out reproductive success into 3 pieces here in order to understand this. So you can think of it as being the number of kids born into your marriage, okay, born to your wives, minus those kids who you're not the biological father of, right? So those are the losses. Plus, you get to add on any kids who you have fathered outside of marriage, right? So with your girlfriends. Does that make sense? Okay. So what I'm going to focus on mainly is the sort of net cost of the extra pair paternity. So I'm going to ignore this piece and focus on the gains minus the losses. So in a thought exercise, I'm going to go through a couple different scenarios of what might be happening, right? So one is that you've got winners and losers. So they've got big extra pair gains, so they're having lots of kids with girlfriends, and those guys are also able to keep their wives very faithful, right? So these are really, they're great guys, which is so they can get all these girlfriends, and their wives are also staying faithful to them, right? So they have big gains and small losses, and versus this poor other guy who has his wives, a lot of his kids with his wives are actually not his biological offspring, and he's also not very successful in being able to father any kids with anybody else, right? So you've got this big disparity in reproductive success there, right? So that's one possibility of how this could operate. Another possibility is a kind of dads and cads strategy, right? So you've got this guy who has big gains, right? He's out there having a lot of kids with other people, but then his wives are not actually very faithful to him at home, right? He's off kind of expending his energy elsewhere. So he's got, oh, sorry, this should say big losses, sorry. And big, sorry, that must not have changed. But anyway, this guy here has, oops, sorry, big losses. So he is, sorry, is this just a repeat of the same text, huh? Let me see. So this guy is the dad, right? So he's the one who should have small losses. So he is not, his wives are staying faithful to him. He's a good father. He's investing a lot, but he's not gaining a lot outside, right? So that does wind up in this kind of balance scenario. Or you could have something happening where the lifespan matters, right? So when you're young, you're going out and having a lot of these extra pair partnerships, you're gaining a lot, but then as you get older, you're actually the one who's losing out to those young guys who are coming in and are your wife's boyfriends, okay? All right, so this is a cross-section of men of all different ages, because I don't have longitudinal data to look at as easily on this, but it parses out these different pieces here, right? So the kind of teal color are the marital reproduction, right, where it's your child through marriage, and that sort of, as you would expect, for men is going to be very minimal until they don't get married, typically till their late 20s. But you see that rising with time, right? You have polygyny, and so they're gaining a lot of kids through marriage. Then these are the losses, right? So these are the kids that you have to subtract because they were born to your wives, but they're not actually yours. And you see those, again, slower to accrue, but then they keep growing across your lifespan. Whereas the extramarital gains, you see a big jump, and then that really levels off in these older years. Okay, so you're not continuing to accrue too many of those as you age. And what happens is then, if you look at what's happening over time, you basically see this balancing out. Okay, so if you look just at the oldest group, they're averaging around 0. So their gains and their losses are basically evening out over time. So I think what's going on here seems to be this kind of lifespan effect, where there are these different stages where you're in a big gain period, and then your gains start to go down, and your losses continue to accrue. And one of the other interesting things here, right, that's important to think about is reproductive skew. So the way that demographers tend to look at skew is they just measure how many kids you have with your wives. And if you looked at that in this population, you would see this across the cross-section of men, you see this very strong skew because you've got a lot of these zeros. When you actually start to take into account these gains and losses, you see a dampening of the reproductive skew. So I think that's sort of an interesting piece of the puzzle to consider. Okay, so to wrap up, why are these concurrent partnerships so common and so commonly accepted in this community? Well, one is I think that there are some significant benefits to women of having these multiple partners. Again, I think that what's going on here is sort of a variation of that picture I presented in the beginning, where you do have this stronger tie with your formal partner, and that does matter. But you also have these other weaker ties, and the combination of those all together really seems to provide some important benefits to women. And then, in addition, the cost to men seem to be pretty minimal, right? So the net lifetime costs are at about 0. They're not actually losing very much here. And that if they're investing in those kids, they seem to be offsetting that investment by the child labor that those kids are bringing in. So this is, in a pastoralist society, child labor is really critical. That's not always going to be the case in every kind of subsistence economy, right? But here it seems like the costs to men are pretty minimal. There are other things I didn't have time to get into about separation of spouses. They have a very strongly female bias sex ratio. There's other factors here that I think also kind of are the perfect storm of why you see such a high level of concurrency and extra pair paternity in this particular place. But it seems to be something that is a really good fit in this particular context. So I want to thank, first and foremost, the families in Omohanga who have been so warm and open with me for the last 10 years. I would obviously never have been able to do this without them, and also without all of their really tremendous insights that have helped me to understand what's going on. Co-directors of the project are Sean Prahl, who's now at University of Missouri, and Jacob Shihama at University of Namibia. Brenna was really instrumental in the genetics piece of the project, and Richard is the other piece of the double-blind puzzle, and that he does all the actual stats so that I don't see any individual level results. And then our team of people both in the hen lab working on the genetics piece, and then our team of people working with us in the field. So that's it. Thanks. Yeah.
Thanks, Mike. It's really cool to see everything all together. I was wondering, did I understand correctly that the last two slides you're showing are the dependent variable there is the assertion, the paternity assertion of the
Last
fathers?
two slides in
So the one about the study about the whether fathers invest in their Omoka children, and the last thing that you showed, there you're using their paternity assertion data, right, and not the genetic data?
For this, yes, sorry. Both of those are based on assertions, so we haven't rerun those. So now that we know they're pretty accurate, we don't think the results will change that much, but yeah.
Yeah, I was just wondering whether you'll be able to do that with even within like the double-blind
So
design of the study?
yeah, so we can. So one of the great things about the double-blind study is that it allows us to be able to actually use all of the cool individual level data that we have, because we give that to Richard and then he gets the result, the paternity result, and he actually runs all of the stats and I only see the aggregate. So we could use all of that, but I still wouldn't see it. As far as what's the best thing to use, I think that's actually a slightly different question, because if you're looking at investment, the best thing to use, I think, is actually still the assertion. Because what you want to know is what they think, because they're making these decisions about investment based on whether they think the child is there. So what we could do is, based on this error rate, knowing that the error is almost all in one direction, right? I think there are ways that we could probably build that into the analysis to try to kind of make up for the fact that we know that there is this kind of strong skew in the direction. But as far as the reproductive skew, the plan when we actually we have not really formalized that yet. So the plan would be for that to use the actual genetic data. Yeah.
Okay, yeah, I was just wondering because I think maybe the differences between how the Omoka and the non-Omokas are treated might be even bigger if you take into account that they're given these false positive data.
Yeah, I mean, I think that there are probably so what there would be then is likely cases where the father said the child is theirs even though they believed it wasn't. And so, yeah, again, so I think we could try and account for that error, but without, I mean, I always also, every time I go back, if I see somebody again, I'm rechecking their history. So there's a kind of trade-off there about the purity of whether the first time we ask them should be the answer we stick to versus continually updating. And I have opted to continually update on this because I do think that the accuracy of the information gets better as I get to know people better. And so we were just sort of writing about that in the limitations of one of the paper, I think the paternal investment paper, because it is a trade-off. Yeah. Danny, did you still have a question?
Yeah. Sorry. So in the first couple slides, the questionnaire that you gave the women, the true false, I was just wondering if you had demographic data of the women, if those women, if there was a bias, maybe they had boyfriends or all of them didn't have boyfriends.
Yep.
How that was done.
Yeah, so it was both men and women who were asked. And I did look, so I just collected that, like I got back September 23rd. So this was like as much as I could do before this talk. But I did look to see whether there were any differences if I looked only at the women's responses versus the complete sample. And there really were hardly any differences. So it does seem to be that the consensus is equal. But we do have information for everybody who filled it out at the bare minimum of age, marital status, number of kids, and number of boyfriends or girlfriends. Yeah. I have not factored any of that in yet. Yeah. Andrew?
Yeah, so thanks for your talk. I had two questions. The first one is, do you have any data that can speak to sort of the temporal dynamics of like acquiring and then losing like boyfriends, and does it tend to track sort of the ebb and flow of number of dependent offspring? And if so, do you have any evidence that suggests that sort of there's a like overt awareness of this? It's like, oh, okay, I've got another one coming, like I should probably get my ducks in a row, or is it sort of more implicit?
Mm-hmm. As far as the ebb and flow, so I'm hoping, so I think I want to get a lot more of these reproductive histories, because we started getting them last summer and I got some more this summer, but I think that they're really telling about some of the sort of the history of these relationships, and if you know how long they lasted, sort of when they, like the onset and offset of them. And also we have been tracking for a number of years now just how many boyfriends you have, so we have that for 2017, 18, and 19. So you'd be able to see a little bit of that too. I don't know that I have not looked to see whether it tracks onto number of dependent offspring. And as far as whether they kind of explicitly talk about that, I haven't heard people linking it so directly to the number of dependent kids as much as just that this talk about them needing them, that the resources that they're bringing in are important. I mean, but the other thing is, right, it's a mixed bag, right? Because they also say things like, yeah, boyfriends are fun, but they're not as helpful, right? Like you definitely see that they're sort of holding these multiple ideas about these boyfriends, all right? And they're giving a lot of like bracelets and things that are not very useful, right? But one of the things that I didn't put in here, because again, I'd like to get a bigger sample before I actually present it, is thinking about the kind of emergency thing. So in the consensus analysis, they did say that your boyfriend should help you in an emergency, and if you need if you're hungry, your boyfriend should bring you milk or maize or meat, right? And so we have like last hospital visit and last clinic visit, and who helped you to pay for those expenses. Because anecdotally, women will say things like, well, yeah, one of my kids got really sick and I needed like 1,000 Namibian dollars to be able to pay for all the expenses. And it was not actually the kid of this boyfriend, but she said that she called on that. And so it has to, again, be this workaround, because you can't, the direct asking is a problem. So, but she sent, it was either a friend or one of her older daughters, to his compound, and they just sort of announced like, so-and-so's son is, very sick and needs to go to the hospital, and it's really, and then he can choose whether or not to do something. But she said, in this case, like he sold a cow, and that was a lot of money that could then come back through this friend or daughter to her to help her pay for those expenses. So that might be, again, with this stochasticity of who's around and who has access to resources. It's a really drought-prone environment. I think that might actually be as much or more of a factor as the kind of smaller additive effects.
I thought I just asked the second question as well. Sorry.
So I thought the second question was. That was okay. Yeah. Sorry, that was two-part first question. And now second question. Go ahead.
The second one was just regarding sort of like, do you have any insight as to what the mechanism for detection of children who are fathers versus? Yeah.
So part of it is phenotypic matching. And I've gotten a little better at it myself. Like I can now see, I don't know whether I'm right because I can't ever see the results, but I can, you get kind of good at it where you're like, that kid looks a lot like that guy who lives not here. So, but also, and so I'm interested now at looking at things of like, does it get better with age, right? Both Himba and actually where I worked in Australia, people talked about the fact that like walking around age, kind of toddler years, are when you can really start to see the phenotypic matching kicking in. And they also just talk about absence. So because spouses spend a significant period of time separated, that they say, well, I knew my husband wasn't around at this time, things like that. But I have data on number of sex partners in the last 30 days, and it's not uncommon at all for women to have had more than one sex partner in a cycle. So that would, make that absence thing obviously harder. Dan?
So let me preface this one by saying that it's conceptual remark and not a evidentiary critique of the method, because it's amazing what you've done. And collecting the evidence to be able to answer this question would be really difficult. But I still think it merits consideration as just the level of explanation. So in presenting the it all kind of balances out fitness argument at the end there, one way of thinking about that, so you might ask, well, how'd they get into this equilibrium, right? And maybe it's about child labor, maybe it's some kind of phylogenetic cul-de-sac culturally. But you look at like the Tiwi, for example, where you have this gerontocracy, right? And it clearly men can set up systems in which they can keep their younger cohort in check, right? So one way of thinking about this is, okay, well, it all washes out and there's some child labor benefit or something like that, so fine, okay, they don't push towards the Tiwi equilibrium because they don't need to, right? But another way of thinking about it is, it's kind of analogous to like the grandmothering hypothesis, which is, what is the fitness value of each of those children? Okay, so you're counting babies right now, but there's increasing evidence that paternal and maternal age both contribute to offspring fitness. Mm-hmm. So arguably, the child that a man has as an Amoka child when he's young is actually more valuable than the child that he has with his
sixth wife when he's 80.
Right, exactly. Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Even when that is his biological child, right? It's not his social child, it's his biological child. So if that's the case, then what you might be seeing, when I say here, analogous to the grandmothering situation, is that like everyone's racing to get babies early, mm-hmm. and then, well, you're still alive and you've amassed capital and all the rest of it. You might as well make the best of the situation by continuing on, even though those kids are in actuality less valuable than the ones that you had before. And that, it seems to me that offers an explanation for why you don't get a gerontocracy, right? Because everyone is actually trying to have their sons, for example, have early success, right? Mm-hmm. So it's not just, well, I don't want anyone having access to my wives. I actually do better by having my own sons have access early in their career.
Yeah. I mean, that's certainly a possibility. I think there's also like a cultural possibility, or sort of cultural and ecological kind of possibility for it, which is that the cost of maintaining fidelity of your wives may sort of grow over time. So they have like their home compound and they have a cattle post, and depending on the particular drought in the year, they spend sometimes up to 40% of the year separated from their wives. And so the costs of mate guarding are actually quite high. And so which allows for these young men to be able to sort of swoop in more easily, right? And then also like leads to then these losses. And then, I mean, what would be interesting, I think, is, so we have a small data set of looking at like spousal separation across the different seasons, but if we had more of that where we could look at it across men's ages and the number and like the ages of their dependents who could potentially help. So once you've got sons who are like mid to late teens, then they can be the ones who are out at the cattle post and you can stay home more. So I think there may be these kinds of fluctuations, but we need a much bigger sample to be able to see if that was actually constraining them in a way that it affects these losses and gains. But so I think, I'm sort of perplexed by this too, because you see other pastoralists, right, who are in these similarly arid conditions. They presumably have similar costs to mate guarding, and you don't see this level of extra pair paternity. So I don't, like, everything that I keep sort of thinking maybe is the thing, I can quickly think of a counterexample where that same constraint is there and you don't see it. So I think also the sort of inertia of the social and cultural norms may be a big piece of this, and that they come from presumably a matrilineal system, and now they have this double descent. So it's setting up lower expectations on male investment, strong associations with maternal kin. You tend to, those kind of phylogenetic legacies tend to have just more openness toward extramarital sex. And so it could be that, again, it's just this sort of perfect storm where you see this being the equilibrium in this place, and it might not actually translate all that well somewhere else. But yeah, it's continuing to perplex me. Yeah, Gandhi.
Do you have any insights or gut feelings about whether or not this pattern is something the Himba have had for thousands of years versus hundreds of years versus decades?
Yeah, so I think hundreds of years probably, but not thousands, because they weren't their own cultural group for that long. But so the earliest ethnographies are from like the 40s, and they talk about these same patterns. They're not quantifying them, but they, in terms of just discussing the norms, it's there. So I think, and again, the neighboring groups, so if you look at a phylogeny of these Bantu groups, you see double descent, at least, in the close neighboring groups. And so probably, it's going back to at least one of those roots. So it does not seem, so, I mean, this is what I think is interesting when you think about this compared to the large literature on transactional sex, right, is that most of that is framed as being a response to globalization and market economies and things like that. This is clearly something that's been going on a lot longer than that. So.
I have a question about how you try to reconcile the fact that you say it's about 50-50 in terms of husband, children, and boyfriend. But the data on sex or frequency seems to suggest that it was much more common with husband than with boyfriend. So is that an age effect, or is that the number of partners? That's the first question. The second, if you have time, you mentioned conception, and I would love to hear more about it and how it's used, whether it's used later in life or to space or throughout life.
Yeah. So it's it's still, I think, a pretty small data set on the date of last sex. And you're still getting them having, I mean, within 30, I'm trying to think if I made a graph of this that I didn't show, of like what percentage of them still had sex with their boyfriend in the last 30 days, for example. It's I don't know if it's I don't think it's a majority, but I think it's a substantial proportion. I think but you do definitely have these boyfriends, right? It's almost, I'm wondering if it would look either bimodal or trimodal or something like that, because there were these partnerships where people are saying like, yes, he's my boyfriend for sure. I have not had sex with him in 2 years, right? And also then you'd have to pull out also the postpartum people, because there's this long, not just the period of pregnancy, but then there's a postpartum, actually peripartum and postpartum taboo. So once we get more data, I think we could look at that. But it seems like there are some, just anecdotally, there are some people who are their boyfriend, who they see regularly, and are not the father of any of their kids. So I don't know. I think we need more data to be able to look at that. And the second question about contraception. So in 2010, my first real field season, I interviewed 110 women, and I was asking them about had they heard of any form of contraception, had they ever used it, and were they currently using? It was very rare that they had ever used, and nobody was currently using. Some people had heard of it, and Renee was out last summer with me, and she was asking this as part of a different study, and it was, I think, it was young women only in the sample, right, or pretty young, women who'd given birth in the last year, yeah, right? There were some. And it was, I think now the majority had ever used, right? Yes, I think about 70%. Yeah, so that's a really big shift that's happened just in the last decade, basically. And I've heard people talking about it in terms of I don't want more kids, and I don't want more kids right now, so more of a spacing thing. But I haven't systematically looked at that. Yeah.
Since I'm sitting between Marty and Patrick, I'll just address one aspect of Patrick's remark you took up on, which is how is it that, women can be reporting sex more frequently with husbands, and yet the genetic data indicate 60%, right? And the answer is timing, right? That is, depends when they're having sex. So you can have frequent sex, but if it's outside of the fertile window, then that's going to result in a lower probability.
Yeah, I think, the question that I have is how much control they have over that timing, right? So when marital sex, you're often on a rotation, so it depends on number of co-wives and things like that, right? But the men will often say, like, I'm with wife 1 for 2 days and then wife 2 for 2 days, and they kind of rotate. And then there are these long periods where the husband is away, so it's not possible at all, right? And so this could also be an artifact of what time of the, well, not always, but I'm usually there at the same time of year. So it could be that if I go at a different time of year, I might be more likely to pick up on like longer periods of time since last sex with husbands. I thought very hard about whether I could replicate Marty's work with Himba, but to do it right, you would have to really, I think, get daily urine samples, and I'm just not there for a long enough period of time to really be able to do that. So, because you'd want to, and then I had it planned in my head, right, that I was like, okay, you can get these daily urine samples to test LH levels, look for the surge, right, and then I could call them on their cell phones every day and ask them, like, have you had sex in the last 24 hours with who? Then come out, give them a pregnancy test. So I think it's like, in a dream world, possible to actually look at that and see whether they actually are biasing their the sex towards these informal partners when they're at high fertility, but I couldn't figure out a way to feasibly be able to do it. Yeah.
So you said that you're not sure how much control they have because the husbands are away, and that's when these opportunities are available. How much gatekeeping do women do with their husbands and with their boyfriends? So how much does their own preference figure in if that person is present?
So I don't think they're able to do all that much gatekeeping, actually, either men or women, right? And so they can have sex with a boyfriend. The easiest time is when the husband's away, or if he's cycled off and is with one of the other wives. You have to be a lot more careful about the sneaking in and out in that situation than you do if he's away, obviously. I've had women, like, one instance comes to mind where I had just been interviewing this woman, and I think she was the one who gave me that quote about, you love your husband so much that you think of him when you're milking the cow, but then when he leaves, you're with somebody else. So she had just been talking to me about her own kind of concurrency. And then I was driving out of the compound, and her husband wanted to come with us we were going into like the closest town to go pick some stuff up. And so he wanted a ride. And so he hopped in the car, and she comes running out of the car, and she's like banging on the car window to insist to us that we bring him back. Because if he goes to town, he's going to stay there, and she doesn't want that, and he needs to come home. And so, but I mean, that's the only instance of that kind of gatekeeping. Yes. So I have data on refusing sex for different reasons. It's like one of the things I've just been collecting, so I haven't looked at it. They're pretty okay, actually, with both men and women, with saying that you can refuse sex. So refusing sex if the husband has an STD, I would say the majority said that was okay. But refusing sex because he has other girlfriends was actually like probably one of the lowest in terms of them saying that that's okay. Yeah, I had not in the mood. That was also on the low end of saying that they could refuse for that. Yeah. That didn't seem to be a very good reason. And I talked to them about, like, what if you just have a headache or you just don't want to?
So the expectation then is if the person is physically present in bed, then you're going to have sex with them.
Yeah.
And you're not within those periods of time.
Yep.
And it's his choice, not hers.
So it seems from that refusal question that she doesn't have that much choice to be able to just say no for no reason kind of thing. Again, I haven't quantified that, but that's my sense from having done none is that that's common. Go ahead.
What about soliciting the boyfriends. So, you know, like, how much can you, I mean, so there's the practical considerations, but like, how much can you invite or solicit
Yeah.
the boyfriend?
So,
Or the husband?
so I asked them, like, well, how do you arrange for this? Especially before cell phones, right? Like, how do you arrange for this? So typically what happens is that, like, now with cell phones it's easier, but they're often use go-betweens. So they'll tell somebody who they know is going that direction or is heading to that compound, like, hey, just FYI, my husband's out of town, and, you know. So there's that. And then also they say they meet at the water point. So, like, there are these kind of common, so you saw, like, a lot of times they're seeing them often, right? They'll say, yeah, I see them all the time. So they'll be at the water point and then they'll make a plan. And sometimes they actually don't, so most of the time I think he's going to her compound, but if she's unmarried, then she also they could meet, like, in the riverbed, in the sand in the riverbed. So.
Now, on one of your early graphs, you showed some of these relationships last like a really long time,
Yeah.
50 years, which means they're postmenopausal for the women.
Yep.
So there's a bond there.
Oh yeah. Yeah, they speak. I mean, I think there is a real emotional connection often with these men. So we asked. I haven't crunched these numbers yet, but we asked them in those relationship histories, do you love him very much? Does he love you very much? Would he be there for you if you needed something? Does he or she have many other partners? And they almost all say, actually, almost all the women say yes to that they think their male partners have other partners. The men, there were more men who tended to think but the problem is many is subjective, right? And so if she has only, like, often what they would say is, no, she only has one boyfriend or two boyfriends, you know, me and one other or something, and they would not consider that to be many. So it's a little hard to gauge from that question. Actually, it probably wasn't worded that well. And then, do you think you'll still be together in a year? So those were the ones we were trying to sort of get some sense of the quality of the relationship. Oh, sorry.
I know that there are, I mean, is there, yeah, go ahead. How many more questions are there? Is there like one? Okay, sorry.
Coffee, come to coffee.
So, sorry, it was an incredibly interesting talk. I know we have many more questions than we have time for. We're going to coffee, invite you to come. Please, hopefully, Brooke will stick around for a few minutes to chat with any people who have pressing questions right now. Please join me in thanking our speakers again.